Welcome to the book club. Today we are joined by author Karen Frost. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you for having me.
Karen, you've written 4 books in the Destiny and Darkness series, and the latest one was just published in April. Has your relationship with the characters changed over the 4 books?
I wouldn't say that it's changed. I think when I started off, I didn't know how it was going to end, and it certainly wasn't at its inception intended to be a quartet. It went there, and I think I was happy that it went there because it told a broader narrative. The first 2 books obviously are very closely related. A lot of people felt they should have been one book. Certainly they were treated as a duology, but the overarching narrative I felt really came together if you read all 4. The relationship with the characters, how I felt about them, kind of always stayed the same because they served the purpose that I had originally intended for them.
So just as you've said, you didn't plan it to be a quartet, so I suppose you did not outline all of the plot. But for a single book, are you more of a planner, or do you go where the characters lead you?
Absolutely the latter. And I feel really embarrassed because so many people are planners. I feel like I'm somehow a failure as a writer because not everything is mapped out, and very little, in fact, is mapped out. Very much I let the characters take the story where they want it to go and let the characters be what they want to be. And I think that's a really weird thing to try and explain to someone that doesn't have that experience. But I think the story takes itself in a direction, and I have been fortunate that it has found a direction. It hasn't ended up kind of on a dead-end street.
Coming back to the duology, you chose to put a cliffhanger at the end of book 1. What was the reaction like from your readers, and if you had to do it again, would you do the same thing?
The reaction was negative, as one would expect. And if I did it again, I would absolutely change it. And what I learned from this process is this was my first book. And so that book ended because in some ways it had reached a certain conclusion, but in some ways it also hit the end of the word count. So something that people perhaps don't necessarily realize is that your average word count for young adults is going to be between 60 and about 75,000 words. The first book was a little over 70,000. The second book was also over 70,000. So to combine the two together would have been over 140,000. I mean, it would have been very, very, very long. And then people would have been complaining about how long it was. So at the time, I was like, okay, it's kind of at a logical stopping point. We can continue telling the story in the second book. What I learned is that when you are writing a series, each book really has to be a small circle. You start with an idea and you end with an idea, and the readers feel that there's some sense of fulfillment. And then you have the larger circle that tells the overarching story of this series. But really, if you don't have that fulfillment at the end of each book, readers feel cheated. And they absolutely felt cheated in the first book of this series. Huge learning lesson. I wouldn't do it again, but hindsight is always 20/20.
Is there a character that you feel should have more love, or like your special character to your heart?
Absolutely. 2 of them, actually. It was interesting that readers did not particularly like the third book, which was really unfortunate because I really loved Asher and I loved the Knight Commander. For me, the Knight Commander was this wonderful character that I really hoped that people would latch onto. It was this idea of this brave person who was persevering against adversity, who was showing what leadership was, and she was able to pass that mantle on to leadership. And in all of the reviews I've read, no one once has even mentioned that character, which is like, why would you not mention this strong female character who's a wonderful role model to any female reading this book and trying to learn about what it's like to be a leader and what it's like to be a leader in extreme adversity.
Why choose to write in first person POV, and what were the challenges in writing in first person POV?
Everything I'd written before that was third person omniscient. Writing with that point of view, you really have to inhabit the character, and you have to think, of course, the way that character would. I think often we find when people are writing young adult, there can be a tendency to write to your own age. And obviously I am not 16 years old, I'm not 15 years old. So that part, trying to bring in the errors that people make when they're that age. One of the examples in book 3, a reviewer said, well, she's always making bad decisions. Yes, she's really young, right? And so this idea of you should be, as a teenager, allowed to make those mistakes. You should be allowed to learn and grow, to make illogical assumptions or something like that. So for me, that move to a non-third person omniscient and this idea of, okay, I'm writing this scene, but my character is not omniscient. So I can't write what the other character in the scene is writing. I can only write their reactions. And that was something interesting to learn. And it actually really took the editor pointing some of those things out. Hey, you just said this character reacted, with surprise. You can't say that. You can only say the character raised her eyebrow. So that was interesting to me.
The series is a young adult fantasy fiction, and you've just said teenagers, which is a concept that I feel is interesting because it's kind of a medievalistic era with knights and king and stuff. And teenage is such a post-industrial concept of time. At 16, do you really think that your character is a teenager, given that the old people are like 60, they're ancient? Or is she more like an adult, young but an adult?
I mean, that's a good question. I would counter that there's another problem in writing. I said it's difficult for older writers to place themselves in the shoes of a 16-year-old. The majority, technically, of young adult readers are adults, not young adults. It's not going to be the 16-year-old. It's going to be my father, who young adult is his favorite genre, interestingly enough. So when we write these characters, I do think we write them with more maturity than they would actually have. If you walk into a super mall, a regular mall in America, and you look at what these teenagers look like, you think, my God, I can't believe they can even drive a car. So there is a little bit more maturity. In this case, we allow for the immaturity of going to mage school and whatnot. In that sense, it draws parallels to Harry Potter or something. Your question about, in antiquity, the Romans, you would don the toga of manhood at 14, right? So there would be more maturity there. And when you look at the age that people would have gone through knighting, you would have been knighted at 18. So yes, you would have been considered to have reached adulthood there. So in that sense, I think perhaps there is a little bit more maturity than what we would expect of a modern character.
What was your inspiration in creating the world?
When I was growing up, Tamora Pierce was absolutely the gold standard on writing young adult fantasy for strong female protagonists. And in fact, I think that persisted for probably at least 2 decades. And she always wrote in quartets, which, yes, is certainly an influence for why mine ended up being a quartet. When you read Tamora Pierce, it's the same idea. And within the quartets, there was the Lioness Quartet was her first one, which again is the story of a young woman who becomes a knight. You have the Protector of the Small Quartet, which again is another woman becomes a knight, or girl becomes a knight. And then you have, I think it's called the Wild Magic Quartet or something similar, where a girl becomes a mage. So that was absolutely the inspiration. It was looking at what was so successful and so pivotal to young adult fantasy for women. And I thought, I would like to kind of create that same sort of feeling, same sort of ambiance. Because I think in modern young adult fantasy, we moved to more of a focus on maybe like romance. Oh my God, she's pining after this guy or something like that. And I really wanted it to stay true to that idea of high fantasy, but really focusing on the role of women in that environment.
What's the easiest part of writing for you?
A lot of authors struggle to write. It's the actual putting words on the paper part where they talk about writer's block. And I don't have that. When I open up my computer and want to write, there's always something to write. So I do feel good about that. I'm sure that at some point it will hit me the way it hits others, but I'm not quite there yet.
And on the downside, is there something that's really hard for you in the writing process?
Yes. It's hard as a writer not to compare yourself to others. And there are some people out there, some fantasy writers that are just absolutely amazing at world building. Laini Taylor is one. She did the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series. She just did Strange the Dreamer, that duology. And she just has this amazing ability to see with her mind and write what she sees. And I find I'll never be that person. So for me, I have to remember to really stop and take a minute and write details, because otherwise I will have a tendency to just kind of blow through, and it's like, and then they met this person and then blah, 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 right? And it's like, oh, wait, got to remember to describe what this person looks like without making it very awkward and obvious that that's what I'm doing.
If writing comes naturally, how many books do you work on at the same time?
Only one. It's very difficult for me to do more than one at once, because then you're starting to confuse not the storyline or anything, but the characterization of the characters. I think that's a big risk that you'll just have bleed over. I have written and edited at the same time. It's certainly not my preference. I just end up putting one on hold and working on the other and then coming back to it. I suppose other people don't have that problem, but again, I think the risk of characterization bleed is large, especially if your characters are similar. Let's say it's both young female protagonists, you might find that the qualities that you gave to one all of a sudden have started to bleed into the other.
Do you need some specific setting to write, or are you an author that can write anywhere in any circumstance? Do you need music, silence, pen, paper, computer, cell phone?
Absolute silence, and I write on my laptop, but any sound, and it's just so hard for me to focus, to just kind of shut off and not be listening.
Fantasy as a genre doesn't necessarily sell well in Lesfic. So, why did you choose to write fantasy, and why particularly young adult fantasy?
Yeah, wouldn't you know, I choose the two genres that sell the absolute worst, and as you can expect, it did not go well. But you know, when you talk to authors, and there's a choice: do you write to the audience, and so you're writing what you think they will buy, in which case I would have to write contemporary romance, or do you write what you believe should exist in the world and what you would want to read? In my choice, in my case, I made the choice to write what I thought should exist, what if I was a high school student or a college student, would want to read. Now, the interesting thing is, when we talk about whether something sells well or not, I would argue that that is an oversimplification. I think there's a publicity problem. And the reason I say that is, if we look at Melinda Lowe's Ash, which was published, I believe, 2009, maybe. I mean, it's been reissued. It's sold very well. She just had, I think it's Last Night at the Telegraph Club, sell very well. So her fantasy books have done quite well. And of course, everyone has been talking about Gideon the Ninth. We have these examples that show that there is an audience and it can be sold. The question is, how do we get those types of books into people's hands? And so you have a Gideon the Ninth, or you have a fantasy or a young adult fantasy that doesn't sell well, and then people say, well, it doesn't sell. It's like, well, is it that it doesn't sell, or that we couldn't get the right eyes to look at it and then engage in amplification on social media?
To jump off on this, so publicity is definitively a challenge for young adult fantasy. Do you do something for that? Like, do you volunteer yourself to high school lecturing program or something to put a spotlight on either your book or the genre?
No, I don't actually know if that's a thing in my area. You know, it's interesting because some of the publicity measures that have been recommended for authors, I find, don't necessarily work for my genre. So a lot of times people will do newsletters, or they'll go onto Reddit. The newsletters might work in contemporary romance. It doesn't really seem to work in the fantasy genre. I could certainly be wrong, but I don't really find that working. And when I look at other authors in that genre, they don't really seem to be doing it. And I think it's kind of a black hole. What do you do? And you have a lot of writers in the genre that are finding the same experience. So if someone has an answer on that, definitely shout that out to the community, because I think the unfortunate part about that is, as the narrative gets compounded that this doesn't sell, publishers are less likely to put it out. Ilva won't do it again, right? They're done. No more young adult fantasy from Ilva because it won't sell. So trying to get it into schools would be a good idea, but then of course we have, you know, your small publishers now trying to compete against one of the big five publishers. And as the librarians get the catalog, of course, they're going to go with what's being pushed by the big five, because it's presumed to be of higher caliber with more editing and whatnot. So it's kind of a David and Goliath issue. What I do always tell people, though, is it is free, certainly in the United States, to get a library to order a book. There's a book request form you can go in, And so if you want a book on the shelves so that teenagers or whoever can read it, all you have to do is request the book. My old library system, you could request like 60 a year. So as we try and get more LGBT content on the shelves, one way to do that is just to do these requests. If they're free, there's no disincentive to doing it. And so if that's the only way we can take a genre, or we can take, a class of books and get them on the shelves, if we have one person in every district, every county requesting these books, then that's one way to overcome that disadvantage relative to the major publishers.
Apart from Tamora Pierce, have there been any other writers that have inspired you?
I mentioned Laini Taylor and just her really amazing imagination. There is The Forgotten Beasts of Eld. It's Patricia McKinnon, I believe, is the author on that. That's a fantasy. I don't know if it would be termed new adult. It does not feel young adult. I think it was probably written in the 80s. Really amazing book. I think what I like within fantasy in particular, and it's kind of rare, is when you have some sort of overarching message. It's not just some simple story of, this girl wants to be a knight or something, but there's a greater message about this is the effect of war, or this is the effect of sexism. These things that get woven through the narrative that maybe the reader at the time can't articulate, but feels and senses, and then can then feel inspired by, right? This idea of it's not just Harry Potter who's always the chosen one. It can be a woman, or it can be, whatever. I would say that, let's see, I'm trying to think what I've read recently. Sarah Glenn Marsh wrote, I think it's considered a duology, Reign of the Fallen, and I don't remember the sequel. There was some really interesting things done in Reign of the Fallen, and Veronica Roth's Carve the Mark, I think, did some very interesting things. It gets back to that idea of kind of different messaging and different ways of approaching a story.
Is there something you want to touch in your next book that you are afraid of?
Oh, here we go. Okay. So the book that I just completed is not young adult fantasy. It's actually a historical action adventure with a strong romance component. I basically took the idea of The Mummy with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, which everyone loves, that people are talking about on Twitter all the time. And I said, what if instead of Brendan Fraser, it was actually 4 women, right? This idea of 4 protagonists that come from diverse backgrounds and come together on this adventure. And the romance component, I mean, this is not young adult, this is adult. So for me, it's very awkward to write any sort of like romantic or erotic scenes. And so trying to write that scene when you're very uncomfortable with doing it, boy, that was a stretch. I did end up putting a scene in there, but that certainly was difficult for me.
Do you feel like erotic scenes are an obligation in lesfic for adult?
Oh boy. Do I believe they're an obligation? That's very strong. Do I think the readership wants it? Absolutely. I mean, the romance reader lives vicariously through these characters, and I think if you had action adventure, I don't think you necessarily would have to have that, but to get the queer female readers, I think they would be very disappointed if you didn't have something like that, if it was extremely chaste and they never got the sense that there was chemistry between your characters.
When you construct a story, do you construct it in a way that you would enjoy it, or do you always have the reader in the forefront and think, okay, I'm going to write a story for them, no matter what I feel? I think I'm going to write a story that the readers might actually enjoy, or this is what they're looking for.
Yeah, it's always what I would enjoy, which clearly has not always worked out totally in my favor. But I think, again, it depends on what your goals are as a writer. There are certainly writers that have made the decision to try and be as commercial as possible, and that means writing what the readers would like to read. For myself, that would be very difficult to write 70,000 words that I don't really care about. So for me, it will always be what I'm interested in and the hope that other people also find that interesting. For me, because of years of growing up with young adult fantasy and seeing how that was written, kind of the pacing and the focus and all that stuff, hopefully it mirrors that well enough that readers are like, this looks familiar, and they can follow along the characters and the plot and all that stuff. But yes, certainly here's what I would find interesting and what I would want to read.
Would you consider self-publishing if it was what it takes to publish what you want to write?
Yeah, absolutely. And the difficulty with that, as with anything, is finding the readership. But I think one of the things with traditional publishing, people always say like, oh, why can't we have XYZ book, right? There's this idea that not enough is being published. And that's absolutely true. It is almost impossible to get a literary agent and go mainstream publishing. In the lesbian publishing field, I think we still have the 7 presses, LGBT overall, more umbrella, not just lesbian specific. I don't even know how many there are, but there's still books that no one wants to pick up. They're concerned they won't be able to market it. They're concerned they won't get the readership to recoup the costs. In that sense, I still think, if there's a story to be told, definitely the self-publishing route is the way to go. But there's always going to be that concern of how do you reach the audience? It's not necessarily true that no one wants to read it or that it's bad or anything, but it's a lot of work for self-published authors to find that audience that they intend to reach. Some people are very successful at it, and then of course some people are less successful. I think the statistic on self-published authors is they average 300 books sold. Compared to the big 5 is going to be about 3,000, and I'm guessing the indie publishers obviously is somewhere in the middle of that. Let's say maybe 1,000 to 2,000 depending.
What's been the hardest thing to research for Destiny and Darkness?
One of the things about fantasy is that it doesn't have necessarily that research component, right? You can say whatever you want about dragons and who's going to disprove you. You can say whatever you want about magic and who's going to disprove you. One of the harder things was remembering continuity. So if you're on book 4 and then you are trying to remember something you wrote about a character in book 1, you have to go back and refine that. Now, I will say that for this book that I just mentioned, my 5th book, that was a ton of research, historical action adventure. I mean, I was looking up everything. I was looking at transatlantic steamer routes on particular months of a year, right? I was looking at what cars could have been bought in Alexandria, Egypt in 1923, because you never want to be that person who says they went to this restaurant in this year and the restaurant hadn't been established yet. So I think obviously there's certain genres that require more research than others. In some ways, fantasy is almost lazy because you just can make it all up. So yeah, I can't say I necessarily researched anything for Destiny and Darkness. I saved it for the next one.
You didn't need research for fantasy, but you need continuity. Do you use a specific software like Scrivener, or do you just put everything in a Word doc and hope to find it again?
I can't even say I do that. Like I said, I'm just a horrible writer. I have to go back and reread what I wrote. Which, but that's important, right? Because you're reestablishing the continuity, the personalizations that you've created for each character. Who are they? What do they do? How do they do it? So to go back and read, you've read your book at least 5, 6 or more times by the time it's published because of all the layers of editing and all of that stuff. But even if it's been 2 years, I mean, that's forever, right? So you have to go back and double check that. And it's also helpful if you have other readers that say, wait, you said, in book 1, you said XYZ, but now you're saying something else. So yes, if I was clever, I would create Word documents where I have all this laid out, but sadly, not clever.
Do you use beta readers to help you when you're writing?
I did not for my first 4 books. I had friends that read, but that's not beta reading. That's just sending stuff to friends. My 5th book that I just finished, I did use beta readers. And I have to say, I would always use beta readers in the future because it's just so much more helpful. Because when you're writing something, you're like, yeah, this is great. And then a beta reader goes, not as great as you thought. Let's make some edits. And that's just invaluable. And so to anyone that doesn't use a beta reader, swallow your pride and use a beta reader because it's just going to create a better product.
Now, how does an author go about finding a beta reader?
Yeah, I'm not sure how other people do. I have a friend who, her her professional focus is on script writing, actually. So it's a slightly different field, but as a result of that, she's taking classes and stuff on developing narrative and dialogue and stuff. And so that was helpful. And now I have actually a second beta reader, and she has beta read a lot. And that just, I kind of stumbled across her. I know people find beta readers just through Facebook groups, and I mean, it is probably slightly easier than people think to find beta readers, but it certainly would, they don't appear magically out of thin air normally.
Can you tell us a bit more about your next book? Do you have a title? Do you have a release date?
It's called The Lady Adventurers Club, and I am still attempting to find a home for it. Hopefully, one of the LGBT publishers will take it, but it's been really difficult. Honestly, it's gotten a lot of rejections, and that is reflective of the fact that people think that action adventure won't sell among queer female readers, and it will remain to be seen whether that's true or not. I think it's highly unfortunate that the publishing industry believes that this entire genre just can't be successful with queer female readers. But I also am certain that they have statistics to potentially back that up. So Lady Adventurers Club, to me, is something that I had in mind for many years. I mentioned that it's kind of the female version of The Mummy. But one of the things that is cool about it is the four protagonists are all based on real people. So we have one who's based on Bessie Coleman, who is an African-American barnstormer. So she did trick flying kind of at the dawn of aviation. One is based on Gertrude Bell, so the British archaeologist who was active in the Middle East. One is based on Annie Oakley, so the American trick shooter. And then one is kind of an amalgamation of several European mathematicians. So we have these four females. At this time, the 1920s, basically the 1880s to the 1920s, there were a lot of women around the world doing really cool things. I mean, all you have to do is look on Wikipedia and you'll see like Camille Gast or others that was like, they're a parachutist slash car racer slash champion fencer slash alpinist slash, right? Like, we have this idea that women have always been suppressed. And of course they have, but there was just this moment in time, just as the men were starting to do things, women were really breaking out too. Like this woman who biked in the Tour de France, of course she wasn't allowed, but she still finished like 34th, right? Like unofficially. So it's kind of a nod to the fact that you had these women that were doing cool things, but society wasn't necessarily like recognizing it, or it was, but it hasn't trickled down to today. So I'm certainly excited about it because I think it really does bring together some of the cool things about that time period, and bringing together some of the action elements from The Mummy, and then of course, kind of as we know, throwing to queer female readers, hey, and by the way, two of them kind of engage in this romance, and so we have the idea of what does romance look like in 1923 when maybe you weren't even aware that was a thing, right?
How many hours do you write every day, and how does writing make you feel emotionally? Does it make you feel satisfied or tired? Do you think, oh, I'm glad I'm done for the day? Or do you feel like, oh, I want to keep going?
How many hours I write really varies. And honestly, what I write really varies. So obviously I write fiction, but I also write nonfiction too. I write articles about pop culture and specifically about queer female representation on TV. So one day I could be writing about a soap opera in Britain and how they're doing a queer female storyline, and the next day I could be writing, something for one of my novels. The effect is different. Writing the pop culture articles is draining. It's mentally taxing because you're piecing together things. You're trying to think about what is the intended message, what is the message being received, what does it mean for the global landscape of representation. So that's a lot more difficult. The writing fiction stuff is actually relatively easy. And recently, I was tweeting about this because this is funny. I just wrote my third piece of fan fiction, and my poor girlfriend had to deal with me staying up till like midnight to write this fan fiction because it's this interesting idea to take someone else's characterizations of characters, right? We see these characters on screen, we can't hear their inner dialogue, but we can sense it. And so then for the fan fiction writer to really have to think through, because we're normally sticking them in a new situation, how would this character react? How are they thinking? How do I create inner monologue for that character? So that's actually been relatively tiring, and I was so proud of it. And like, no one's read it, but I was so proud of it. I think what we like as viewers, as queer female viewers, what we like when we see this representation on screen is we like the chemistry between the characters. Obviously, this is why people like contemporary romance. We like the dynamic. So the scenario doesn't necessarily matter. It doesn't matter if one's a werewolf and one's a vampire, or one's a cop and one's a medical examiner. We like the chemistry that's created. So what we're drawn to is how good is that chemistry. And I think that's why people like the fan fiction, because it takes that chemistry and says, we're gonna pull that chemistry into a written form so that you can savor that and you can kind of take that for your own.
Do you think chemistry is the most important part of writing a story or a book?
Well, if it's contemporary romance, it is. But not for other genres. So although my series has romance, and although it's a large part of it, it's not the key component. In fact, if I were to explain to people what I think are the key takeaways, it wouldn't be the romance component at all. Like, yay, cool, there's a romance component, and that's great. And hopefully if there are young adult readers that are reading it, they can enjoy seeing that representation and have hope that they can find someone. But ultimately, the themes that maybe an adult reader might take away are different from that, are more than just that.
Just to go back a bit, you've said no one read your fanfiction. Do you want to leave your author tags or something? For what fandom are you writing?
So the first one I wrote was for Clara and Marina, who were on a Brazilian telenovela called En Familia, and I think there's only like 10 fanfics for them total, and I think only like 6 are in English. And the thing is, it kills me because I love this pairing because I love how it was written. And like, no one watches this, but you can find it subtitled in English. It was such a beautiful story because it was the story of this happily married heterosexual woman discovering feelings for this other woman and having to navigate what that means. Like, at what point do you give up the one life that you've established and that you wanted, and you still love that partner? But then now there's this other person, and is that chemistry greater? And what does that mean? And how do you live that life? It was so well done. Total props for that.
What advice would you give to new writers?
I think there is a certain subset of writers, and I don't know if that's the majority or the minority or what, that are very concerned that they're not good enough, that they need to be better. And my feeling is, write what you want to write, do what you want to do, and don't worry about the reader response. Remember that Twilight is horribly written. Stephanie Meyer has no talent as an author, and she is like ungodly rich now, right? So, like, it's terrible. And then they made fan fiction of it, and like EJ Noyes, or no, not EJ Noyes, whatever her name is, is now fabulously rich too, based on her fan fiction of a horribly written book. I think we shouldn't worry about whether we're good enough or if it's like the next Gone with the Wind, if it's this amazing piece of literature, because at the end of the day, readers care about the story. They care about the chemistry, they care about the story. Is the story compelling? All of the other stuff is just, things can be refined in time, but it's an issue of getting things on paper and not worrying about, getting stuck on chapter 1 and worrying that this is the worst chapter anyone's ever written.
Do you always wanted to be a published author, or is it something you stumble upon?
I have been writing since before I could write actual words, and I have the proof of it. My poor mother, I used to write things and then bring it to her and say, read this story I wrote, and it was just gibberish. I feel so bad for my mom, but I, from a very young age, was always writing stuff. Always. I wrote my first book, if you can call it that, when I was in, I think, 9th grade. And I had 5 probably horrible books written by the time I graduated from high school. I mean, there's always that compulsion. And it's funny because I don't think of myself as a storyteller. There are some people that you're like, that is a beautiful storyteller. And that's not me. But I think there's still that urge to create something and to tell a story, which I do find paradoxical. And I suppose that's kind of that, what's the word for it? imposter syndrome, and the feeling that there are so many better people, but nevertheless feeling that I don't know, feeling that there's a story to tell and there's a hole to fill. Because one of the things is when I was growing up, there weren't queer stories. There just absolutely weren't. They didn't even exist until I was basically graduated from college. If you wanted to read anything queer, it was fan fiction. It was Xena fan fiction, honestly. And so feeling like I didn't want young people to have that same experience that I had. I wanted something to be in the world for them. And I think that still persists even today. I can basically name on two hands the number of young adult fantasy books that target queer women. And every year we add maybe 2 or 3 to the pile, but it's still such a small pile. So kind of putting things out there into the world, and even if it doesn't find a huge audience, the hope that that someone will read it and say, hey, that was great, that was just what I was looking for. I guess in many ways that drives me as an author.
So, if writing wasn't in your life, do you think there'd be something else you'd be doing to fill that gap?
God, I'm already doing so many other things too. Funny, because I'm one of those people that I cannot sit still. I cannot sit still. Like my girlfriend, it drives her nuts. Like she's like, can we watch Netflix? And I'm like, I gotta do this other thing. I was a 4-sport athlete in college. The writing thing has been a huge part, of course, but like there's always some form of athletics. I'm currently working on a project trying to see whether we can use the equivalent of angel investing, so direct private investing for queer, female-centric like visual arts products. So like web series and stuff, and whether we can then take that funding model and apply that on a global scale. So I'm test driving the idea of funding web series, and I'm currently working on funding 2 web series. And then ideally we would move this to a broader model where there's investment pools that would then fund potentially movies, like lesbian movies. So I'm working on that too. I just, so much of it is representation based, queer female representation based, and trying to get more representation. But yeah, there's never a down moment.
Does queer web series have a large audience?
So the web series, I actually did a study of this. I looked at, and I can't remember the total numbers anymore, let's say 135 web series, and was looking at YouTube views. And it's interesting because it's like you have about a 1 in 3 chance of getting over 1 million views on a web series, but it's really an issue of like getting into those YouTube search algorithms. So Controlla coming out of Poland, The Other Love Story coming out of India, Girls Like Magic coming out of the US, even Carmilla out of Canada. It's kind of, and the Brazilian web series always do really well. The Stripper has done really well. You really want to hit those big numbers. You want that viewership, and a lot of it is coming out of underrepresented countries, right? Like India gets huge numbers just because there's so little representation that when people see it, they're like, oh my God, I want to watch this, right? So although the assumption in the US is always you don't want subtitled movies because Americans won't watch subtitles, that's not true of the rest of the world. They're so used to seeing subtitles that it doesn't matter that, none of them speak Polish, it's subtitled, they can all watch it.
Is there something about you that your readership would not expect to be true?
Right. Since grad school, I've done karate. So I've been doing karate for about 13 years now, and I'm a second degree black belt. So in the first book, Conspiracy of the Dark, when 2 of the characters are fighting, I kind of, the way the scene was originally written, was going to add in a little bit of self-defense for women. Like, here's what you do when you get attacked, and here's what an actual fight looks like, which I think I ended up paring down quite a bit. But I do think it's important for women to, like, okay, in the middle of a dangerous situation, they're probably not going to remember this one thing they read in a book. But hey, you know what? If they do happen to remember that, that's wonderful and that's helpful to them. So that's another thing that I'm working on and wanting to do more of, is helping with women's self-defense, because I think there's a lot of bad information out there. Cool, it's on TikTok, but also be careful, buyer beware. So
do you read book reviews, and do you find that they influence your writing in any way, or do they help with your writing in any way?
I do read reviews, and I think it's important for authors to read reviews. The actress, I think it was Kat Barrel, from Winona Earp, once said, basically, you have to read all of the reviews or none of them because you can't pick and choose. You can't just read the positive reviews and feel great about yourself and never think critically about things. So I read reviews, but they don't necessarily influence my writing. And the reason being that the review comes so long after you've already written the piece. So my third book, people said, oh, it's so dark. It's so dark. It's too dark to read during COVID. It was written like a year before COVID hit, right? So sometimes feedback is hard to incorporate. And sometimes I think feedback can be difficult because the way that reviews are written nowadays tend to be highly personalized. So the writer will say something like, I give it 3 stars because I don't like high fantasy. And you go, well, okay, like what did you want me to do, right? The reviews at times can become more about the reviewer than the book. What is heartening is when you read a review that actually understands what you were trying to do. What was the theme? What was the messaging? Because I think you have kind of like layers of reviews. You have the review that says, here's what the plot was, which is not super in-depth. And then you have someone that goes through and says, here's what I understood. Here's what I think the author was trying to say. I think I've read one review that actually really understood what I was trying to do and what that messaging was. And it was like, great, it wasn't just in my head. Someone actually was able to pick up on that. So I think authors maybe should use the reviews to check themselves. And if they think they're writing some wonderful work of art with deep metaphors and whatnot, and no one is picking it up, then perhaps they need to be a little less subtle. And if it's too complex and readers are saying it's too complex, I can't follow any of it, then they should simplify.
Do you find the time to read outside of writing? And you've sort of told us what books inspire you, but on a daily, like more of a day-to-day basis, are there any books you've recently enjoyed reading?
I go through phases of what I'm reading. Sometimes I'm reading fiction and sometimes I'm reading nonfiction. I just finished Cafe Europa, which was nonfiction. It was actually one of my college textbooks. I was rereading it. It was a book written by a Bosnian journalist writing about the Balkans after the end of communism. Very interesting. But honestly, I try and catch storylines that I watch on YouTube. And the reason, as I mentioned earlier, is this idea of chemistry between characters and narrative. How are stories told? Because I think that's a really interesting thing, right? Is like, what is it they say? There's 6 forms of conflict: man versus nature, blah blah blah. And I think the man versus man one is always like the most interesting. And so watching how does, in however many episodes, this story get told about these characters and the relationship between them. So it just reads a lot faster to like watch some YouTube clips than to read a whole book. But I read fantasy, I read sci-fi, and then I'll watch basically anything. And of course, nonfiction, I will read almost anything. I'm very eclectic in what I read.
Hi everyone, we're on the This or That section of this video. This or that: paperback, hardcover, or ebook?
Paperback.
Black or white?
Black.
Hot or cold?
Hot.
Socks or blankets?
Blankets.
Bar or restaurant?
Restaurant.
Movie, TV show?
TV show.
Theater or cinema?
Cinema.
Coffee or tea?
Tea.
Mocktail or cocktail?
Mocktail.
Spring or summer?
Summer.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
Sports or arts?
Sports.
And it's done. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. It was lovely to chat to you. Do you have any parting thoughts for your readers?
One of the things that I wanted to do when I wrote this series was talk about the effects of war, because fantasy almost always is about war in some sense, right? There's a knight that has to go fight the war. There's a mage that has to fight in the war, like whatever, right? There's always this idea of violence. And I think in fantasy, it becomes romanticized, it becomes idealized. But I think we should not make that mistake. And so perhaps the predominant, or one of the predominant themes in this series, is the devastating consequences of war, how it becomes this machine that chews everything up, that draws people unwillingly into it. We often find in fantasy the protagonist is some chosen one who has superpowers that has to go save the world. And I wanted this to be about how war is destroying everything, and it's going to destroy Erin too. She doesn't want, her power is to kill, and that is the worst power she could have. She doesn't want that. And also it means she will be killed. And even when we see in book 3, Asher, who has lost her partner to war, in that sense, my books are not just, for young adults to read and enjoy the romance component or the action component, but to think about how we should be wary of what war is and what it does to a society's resources, and the, I guess in some ways, corruption that exists among leaders who cause war, right? Because the people that say we're going to send our people to war are not the people normally that go fight on the front lines themselves, right? What does it mean to them if they lose 10,000 soldiers? Nothing, because they're not affected. And so that's why there's a lot of sadness, in essence, in these books, and particularly book 3, because it's the recognition, and this is very much some of what Commander Bronwyn represents. She always has to send people to their death, and their death weighs heavily upon her. So I do, whether it's a message to readers or whether it's to people in general, this idea of we should not idealize or idolize war. Niall Ferguson wrote about this idea of, in essence, young white males in England romanticizing war, and how, if only they could have gone and fought in World War II, how great it would have been. And the truth is, it would have been absolutely awful, and people come back with PTSD from war, and it's terrible. So that is something that I just wanted to convey in the books, is like, don't read these books about all these people dying and be like, hey, that went well. Like, no, it's horrible, and people lose limbs, and these horrible things happen. So it's that part is a little bit dark, but something for us to keep in mind as the world is constantly at war, that we should not romanticize these things.